The shocking truth shattered everything he thought he knew. Hidden behind the facade of a loving wife was a double life of betrayal, luxury, and deceit. Armed with undeniable evidence, photos, financial records, and damning audio, this husband didn't crumble under the weight of betrayal. Instead, he plotted a bold, calculated revenge that would dismantle her carefully crafted world piece by piece. What happens when lies unravel and karma strikes back? Stick around to witness a story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. The late afternoon sun bathed the quiet suburban street in a golden glow, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds bursting with color. David's home stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modest yet inviting house with white shutters and a red front door. The kind of house that promised warmth and stability, the sort of life David had worked tirelessly to build. Balancing a bouquet of sunflowers and roses in one hand, David unlocked the door, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The flowers were Rachel's favorite, a small token of love to brighten her day. He'd left work early to surprise her, imagining the smile that would light up her face when he walked through the door. A flicker of excitement ran through him as he stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The house was unusually still, the silence striking in a way he couldn't quite place. Normally, the faint hum of the television or the sound of Rachel bustling in the kitchen filled the air. But now, there was only the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. The bouquet rustled faintly as David adjusted his grip, his smile faltering. He moved deeper into the house, his footsteps almost soundless on the polished hardwood floor. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, Rachel's favorite candle still faintly burning somewhere. The tranquility, once comforting, now felt heavy, pressing down on him. A muffled voice drifted from the living room, a voice he recognized all too well, Rachel's. David paused, his heart skipping a beat. The tone of her voice, low, intimate, sent a shiver through him, a warning bell that echoed louder with every step. He took a steadying breath, the bouquet trembling slightly in his hand. Something was wrong, though he couldn't yet say what. All he knew was that the warmth of the afternoon had turned cold, and the house no longer felt like home. David stood frozen for a moment, his senses sharpening as if his body instinctively knew something was wrong. The house, usually a comforting haven, felt alien. The faint creak of the front door closing seemed louder than it should have been, the sound hanging in the unnaturally silent air. The golden light from the windows no longer felt warm, but stark, highlighting the stillness of the furniture and the empty hallway stretching before him. His heart, which had been brimming with anticipation moments ago, began to beat faster, not with excitement, but with a growing unease. He stepped forward cautiously, his shoes barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself resisted his movement. The faint scent of Rachel's favorite vanilla candle lingered in the air, but instead of its usual comfort, it felt cloying, out of place in the suffocating silence. His ears strained against the quiet, and then he heard it. A low, muffled voice coming from the living room. David's breath hitched. It was Rachel's voice, unmistakable, yet it carried a tone he hadn't heard in a long time. There was a softness to it, an intimacy that felt foreign, almost secretive. He edged closer to the source, his footsteps deliberately light. As he approached the living room, the voice would have warmed him, but now chilled him. "Eric, you're unbelievable," Rachel's voice came through, the words laced with a breathless excitement. David's pulse quickened. Eric? The name struck him like a bolt, unfamiliar yet immediately threatening. He pressed himself against the wall, his hand gripping the bouquet tightly, the crinkling paper a faint echo of his unraveling composure. From his hidden vantage point, he peeked around the corner. Rachel was on the couch, her back to him. She wore her noise-canceling headphones, completely absorbed in a video call. Her laptop rested on the coffee table, the bluish glow from the screen illuminating her relaxed, smiling face. It was a smile David hadn't seen in months, maybe years, a genuine, carefree expression reserved for someone else. And the way you let me. I can't stop thinking about it, she continued, her voice dropping to a low murmur. David's breath caught. The bouquet slipped from his trembling hands and landed on the floor with a dull thud, but Rachel didn't notice. She was too engrossed, leaning forward slightly, her fingers playing with a loose strand of her hair. A gesture so natural, yet so revealing. David felt the walls close in, his chest tightened, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Every fiber of his being wanted to step into the room, to demand answers, to force her to explain, but he didn't. His instincts told him this wasn't the moment. Without making a sound, he backed away, each step feeling like a betrayal of himself, a retreat from the life he thought he knew. As he slipped out the front door, the last sound he heard was Rachel's laughter. Soft, intimate, and, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside, the bouquet hit the floor with a muted thud, a sound swallowed by the heavy silence of the house. The sunflowers and roses, once vibrant symbols of David's love and hope, lay scattered, petals crushed under the weight of his trembling hand. He stared at them for a moment, his mind unable to process the contrast between their bright colors and the sudden darkness that seemed to engulf him. David's breath caught, shallow and uneven, as if his lungs had forgotten how to draw air. His gaze remained fixed on Rachel, sitting comfortably on the couch, her laughter soft and intimate, piercing him like a dagger. She was so at ease, so lost in her conversation with Eric, a name that now burned itself into David's mind. His vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the sheer force of the emotions crashing over him. Shock, confusion, and a gnawing ache in his chest. His body betrayed him, refusing to move. He stood frozen in the doorway, his shoulders stiff, his hands hanging limply by his sides. He wanted to burst into the room, to demand an explanation, to shatter the serene bubble she had wrapped herself in. But he couldn't. His feet felt anchored to the ground, as if the truth he had just heard had rooted him there, forcing him to absorb its full weight. Then came the sharp sting of reality. Her words echoed in his mind. "Eric, you're unbelievable. I can't stop thinking about it." Each syllable was like a shard of glass cutting deeper into his already fragile heart. The laugh she shared, the tone she used. It wasn't just a casual slip. It was a declaration, a window into a world he hadn't been a part of. It was betrayal. His fingers twitched, his nails digging into his palms, grounding him in the moment. He glanced down at the bouquet, now crumpled and lifeless, and something inside him snapped. It wasn't anger, not yet, but a profound sense of loss, as if the flowers represented the fragility of everything he had once believed about their life together. David took a step back, the sound of his heel on the floor almost deafening in the oppressive quiet. The motion seemed to unlock his body, and he turned, moving toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. Each one felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing down on him like a physical burden. His mind raced, replaying the scene, the tone of her voice, the way she smiled. A smile that was no longer his. As he reached the front door, his hand hesitated on the handle. A part of him wanted to stay, to confront her, to demand the truth. But another part knew better. He needed clarity, not just raw accusations. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about understanding how deep it went, how far she had strayed from the woman he thought he knew. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound final, almost resolute. The fresh air outside did little to ease the tightness in his chest, but his steps grew steadier as he moved away from the house. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it a new feeling began to stir. Determination. David knew he couldn't confront her without proof, and he would get it. Whatever it took, he needed the truth. The decision to hire a private investigator wasn't easy for David, but it felt necessary. That night, after leaving the house with his mind racing, he sat in his car and dialed the number he had been given by a trusted colleague months ago, a contact he never thought he would need. Paul answered after the first ring, his voice calm and efficient, instantly putting David at ease. Paul didn't ask for unnecessary details. "I'll handle everything," he said, his tone firm. "You'll have answers soon." It was the kind of assurance David needed, even if the words carried the weight of impending truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But the fact made it tough to sleep. Over the next few days, Paul worked quickly. He shadowed Rachel as she left for errands or lunch appointments, snapping photos from a discreet distance. His methods were meticulous: long-range cameras, subtle positioning, even occasional recordings of conversations that she thought were private. David received updates daily: crisp photos of Rachel stepping into sleek cars, entering unfamiliar buildings, and always smiling in a way that felt alien to the woman he thought he knew. Each. David appreciated it. He needed that detachment to balance the emotional storm raging inside him. There was a sickening mix of double life unfold and relief at knowing he wasn't imagining things. Paul's professionalism was cold and unwavering, but David appreciated it. He needed that detachment to balance the emotional storm raging inside him. At home, David became more observant, watching Rachel's every move with new clarity. She was more careful now, though not enough to mask everything. She took her phone everywhere, something she never used to do. She would pause, glance at the screen, and smile faintly before tucking it back into her pocket or leaving the room entirely to answer a call. Her laughter, once warm and familiar, sounded rehearsed when she spoke to him, but genuine when it came from the other room. One evening, as David returned home earlier than expected, he caught Rachel sitting on the far edge of the couch, her knees tucked up, her phone held close to her chest. She was typing rapidly, her fingers flying over the screen, a small private smile playing on her lips. The sight stopped him cold. She didn't notice him standing there, lost in whatever conversation she was having. When she finally looked up, startled, she fumbled to lock her screen, her face a fleeting mix of guilt and irritation. "Everything okay?" David asked, his voice steady but probing. Rachel nodded quickly, her smile now forced. "Just catching up with a friend," she replied, her tone light but her eyes avoided his. David didn't press further. Instead, he walked past her, his chest tightening with every step. The cracks in her facade were growing, and while they hurt to see, they also fueled his resolve. He needed proof, complete, undeniable proof, and Paul was delivering it piece by piece. As the days passed, David's world became a quiet storm of waiting, watching, and steeling himself for what was to come. Each new discovery pushed him closer to the truth, but it also pushed him further from the life he had once thought was real. When Paul handed David the envelope, his face was unreadable. "You'll want to sit down for this," he said, his voice firm but laced with caution. David hesitated before taking the thick folder, his fingers brushing against its edge as if touching the truth might burn him. The air in Paul's office felt heavier than usual, the faint scent of coffee doing little to soften the tension. Inside the envelope, the first photo struck him like a blow to the chest. It showed Rachel stepping out of a sleek black car, her figure wrapped in a form-fitting dress that seemed out of place from her usual wardrobe. Beside her was a man with sharp features, his hand casually resting on her lower back, as if it belonged there. The penthouse loomed behind them, its glass facade reflecting the city lights. A symbol of indulgence, luxury, and secrecy. David's stomach churned. He had never seen her look so carefree, so confident, in recent years. Not with him. Flipping through the photos, the narrative unfolded with ruthless clarity. Rachel wasn't alone in her betrayal. Another man appeared in the images, his face unfamiliar, but his presence unmistakably intimate. The three of them, Rachel, Eric, and this stranger, were captured laughing, drinking, and entering the penthouse as if it were their private sanctuary. The blinds in one image, partially open, revealed fragments of their world: a lavish living room, scattered wine glasses, and a faint silhouette of Rachel leaning close to Eric. The financial documents Paul had uncovered told another story, one even more damning. David scanned the printouts, his eyes locking onto transactions that drained their joint account. Payments labeled Holdings stood out, thousands of dollars funneled toward a shadowy account tied to Eric's name. Luxury hotels, private jet charters, and high-end restaurants dotted the ledger like a map of betrayal. He wanted to worm what this was, but wasn't afraid of what he saw. One entry froze his hand: a $115,000 payment to an exclusive travel agency earmarked for a retreat in the Maldives. The further David read, the deeper the knife twisted. There were subscriptions to elite lingerie brands and a private platform catering to unconventional lifestyles, as Paul had tactfully put it. His jaw clenched as he stared at the receipt for an adult-themed experience, a world he had never been a part of, yet one Rachel had seemingly embraced. But it was the video evidence that shattered him completely. At home, David locked himself in his office, his hand trembling as he inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a dimly lit room bathed in soft golden light. Rachel was there, dressed in a sleek red gown, holding a glass of champagne. Her laugh rang out, carefree and uninhibited, as she leaned toward Eric. The man beside her poured more wine, grinning as if they shared a private joke. Then came the part that turned David's stomach. Rachel, holding a champagne glass, toasted to Eric, her words chilling, to new adventures, and someone who finally understands what life is about. The scene grew more intimate, their movements closer, their laughter quieter, heavier with implications. A third man, holding the camera, occasionally spoke, his voice casual, directing them like a scene from some twisted play. David slammed the laptop shut, his chest heaving. The humiliation was unbearable. Her betrayal wasn't just physical. It was brazen, calculated, and cruel. She hadn't simply cheated. She had mocked him, flaunting her double life while using his resources to fund it. For several minutes, David sat in silence, his fists clenched and his knuckles white. The images and voices replayed in his mind, each one another nail in the coffin of their marriage. But amid the storm of anger and pain, a new feeling began to emerge. It wasn't just resolve, it was clarity. He would no longer be the victim. Rachel had made her choices, but now, so would he. She had built her world on lies, and David would ensure it came crashing down. As he rose from his chair, the folder still clutched in his hands, his expression hardened. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. David sat in his dimly lit office, the financial statements spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle he had never wanted to assemble. His hands trembled as he picked up the highlighted printouts. Transactions that bore Rachel's signature but masked her betrayal. Each line item was another dagger, tuition payments to a university that, upon closer inspection, were grossly inflated, transfers to an account labeled ER Holdings, charges for exclusive retreats disguised as academic workshops. The realization hit him in waves, each one more crushing than the last. He had believed her. When Rachel had come to him a year ago, her eyes brimming with tears and her voice trembling, he'd seen her vulnerability as genuine. "It's for us, David," she had pleaded, gripping his hands tightly. "I want to build a better future for us, but I can't do it without your help." He remembered the way she had leaned into him, the weight of her words making his sacrifices feel worthwhile. Now, those words felt hollow, her plea a calculated performance. The tuition wasn't for her education, it was a cover for indulgence, for luxury, for Eric. David's eyes locked on one receipt in particular, a six-figure payment for a private retreat. He clenched his jaw, the paper crinkling in his tightening grip. That was the overtime he had worked, the trips he had postponed, the dreams he had shelved, all to support her supposed ambition. The memories of her gratitude felt sickening now. He saw her faint smiles as she assured him the money was being put to good use. He heard her laughter, so easy and carefree, while she drained their accounts to fund a double life he hadn't suspected. Every detail replayed in his mind, and the betrayal became almost unbearable. No other wife, he thought, had ever heard him so agitated. She cried when their son was sick. Yet, as the initial shock ebbed, anger began to simmer beneath the surface. Not the wild, uncontrollable rage of a sudden outburst, but a slow, steady burn, a fire that clarified rather than consumed. Rachel's manipulation wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage, it was an insult to everything David had worked for. She had taken his trust, twisted it into currency, and spent it without a shred of guilt. He looked down at the receipts one last time before pushing them aside, his chest heaving with a mix of sorrow and resolve. This wasn't just about mourning what he had lost. It was about deciding what to do next. Rachel thought she had won, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. David stepped into the office of Carter Reynolds, his lawyer, feeling a mix of determination and lingering unease. Carter was a man of precision, his reputation for navigating messy divorces unparalleled. His office mirrored his personality, sleek, minimalist, and efficient. The scent of polished wood and faint leather filled the air as Carter gestured for David to take a seat. "Let's get started," Carter began, his voice calm but commanding. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, David laid out the details, the photographs, the financial discrepancies, the video evidence. He spoke methodically, his tone steady despite the emotional undercurrent. Carter listened intently, his sharp eyes narrowing as David recounted Rachel's deception. When David finished, Carter leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You've got a strong case," Carter said. "The evidence is irrefutable, but this isn't just about proving infidelity. It's about ensuring you're protected moving forward. Here's what we'll do." Carter outlined a strategic plan, starting with filing for divorce on grounds of marital misconduct. He advised David to compile all documents, financial statements, receipts, and records of Rachel's misuse of funds to ensure there was no room for dispute. "We'll also move swiftly to secure your assets," Carter added. "Freeze the accounts, transfer your funds into a private account, and notify the insurance companies to remove her as a beneficiary." David felt a weight lift slightly as Carter spoke. For the first time in weeks, he saw a clear path forward. That evening, David sat at his desk, logging into their joint bank account. His heart pounded as he methodically transferred every remaining dollar into an account Rachel couldn't touch. Each click of the mouse felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. The transactions were swift, the balance on her side dropping to zero. He then contacted the bank to freeze the account entirely, ensuring she couldn't siphon funds elsewhere. The next calls were to the insurance companies. "I'd like to remove a beneficiary," David said firmly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Health, life, and dental, all updated to exclude Rachel." The ease with which he could erase her access to these resources was both sobering and empowering. The following morning, David changed the locks on the house. The sharp sound of the old locks being removed and the satisfying click of the new ones being installed felt symbolic. He stood in the doorway for a moment afterward, gripping the new keys tightly. This was more than a physical change. It was a declaration. The life Rachel had infiltrated was no longer hers to exploit. But he didn't stop there. David called a security company to install cameras and reinforce the alarm system. He walked through the house, checking every window, every door, ensuring nothing was left unsecured. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. He wouldn't let Rachel take anything more from him, not his possessions, not his peace of mind. When Rachel inevitably tried to access the joint account later that day, her fury was immediate. David imagined her reaction as the notification of the frozen funds appeared on her screen. Her calls went unanswered, her texts left unread. He wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. By the end of the day, the divorce papers were drafted and ready for her signature. David stared at the neat stack on his desk, the clean lines of Carter's thorough work representing the boundary he was drawing between his past and his future. David's transformation was undeniable. The man who had once sacrificed endlessly for a marriage built on lies was now reclaiming his autonomy. Each action he took, securing his finances, protecting his home, and filing for divorce, was a step toward a life free of deceit. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a man in control, ready to face whatever came next. And, for the first time in a long time, David felt steady, resolute, whole. The dining room was dimly lit, the single overhead light casting long shadows across the table. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by the faint clink of silverware against plates. Rachel sat across from David, her posture relaxed as she picked at her pasta, scrolling idly through her phone. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an ordinary evening, but David's tightened jaw and the untouched glass of wine in his hand told another story. He reached down, sliding a thick folder from under the table and placing it on the polished wood surface with a quiet but deliberate thud. The sound made Rachel pause mid-screen. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then to David, whose gaze was locked on her. "What's this?" she asked, her tone casual, but her hand hesitated as she set her phone down. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed the folder across the table toward her. "Take a look," he said, his voice steady, almost cold. Rachel hesitated, her expression shifting to something uneasy. Slowly, she opened the folder. The first photograph made her freeze. It was a crisp, damning image of her stepping out of a car in front of the penthouse, Eric at her side. His hand rested on her lower back with a familiarity that couldn't be mistaken. Her face paled. "You? You had me followed?" she stammered, her voice sharp with indignation. David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Keep going," he said simply, ignoring her question. Rachel's hands trembled as she flipped through the photos. Each one was worse than the last. Laughing with Eric, toasting with champagne, entering the penthouse arm in arm with another man. Her jaw tightened as her eyes darted from the photos to David, who sat silently, watching her with an expression of grim resolve. "I can explain," she started, but David cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No more lies, Rachel. Keep looking." Her expression turned defensive, but she obeyed, flipping past the photos to find detailed financial records. Her eyes widened as she scanned the highlighted transactions, payments to Eric's account, luxury hotels, and the retreat in the Maldives. The final receipt, a six-figure payment, made her visibly flinch. "You've been spying on me," she hissed, slamming the folder shut. "That's pathetic, David." David leaned forward now, his voice calm but cutting. "What's pathetic, Rachel, is how far you went to hide all of this, using our money I earned, to fund your double life, lying to me about going back to school while you drained our accounts for luxury trips and whatever this is. Everything." Her composure cracked for a moment, but she quickly masked it with anger. "Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed excitement elsewhere," she snapped, her voice venomous. "You've been predictable, suffocating. Eric, he understands me. He makes me feel alive." David's hands tightened into fists, but his voice remained steady. "Alive?" he repeated. "You mean reckless, selfish, and shameless? That's all I see in these photos. You didn't just betray me. You turned our life into a joke." Rachel's face twisted in fury, but David didn't give her a chance to respond. He stood, picking up the folder. "I thought you deserved to see the truth, Rachel. But now, I'm done." Without another word, he walked away, leaving her sitting there, pale and stunned, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. The silence returned, but this time, it was no longer David's burden to bear. Rachel's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she pushed it back, her face flushed with anger. She slammed the folder shut, sending a few stray papers sliding across the table. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice rising. "You went behind my back like some kind of stalker? What gives you the right to dig into my life like this?" David stayed seated, his gaze steady, his expression unyielding. "What gives me the right?" he said, his tone calm but cutting. "You mean the life I built for us, the money I earned, the trust you destroyed, that gives me every right?" Rachel's voice grew louder, almost desperate, as if she could shout her way out of the truth. "Don't act like a victim, David. I had to do this. You were boring, predictable. Nothing I did was ever enough for you, Eric. Eric made me feel alive, something you couldn't do." David's hands rested on the table, his fingers curled lightly into the wood's surface, but his voice didn't waver. "Alive?" he echoed, his words slow and deliberate. "No, Rachel. This isn't about being alive. It's about greed, selfishness, and betrayal. You didn't just cheat on me. You stole from me, lied to me, and threw away everything we built together like it meant nothing." Rachel scoffed, her hands flailing as she leaned forward. "Oh, spare me the self-righteous act, David. You think you're some kind of saint? You think I enjoyed being married to someone who never took risks, never made me feel special? I had no choice but to look elsewhere. David stood now, towering over her. His calm demeanor didn't crack, but there was a sharpness in his tone that cut through her rant like a blade. You always had a choice, Rachel. You chose to betray me. You chose to humiliate me. And you chose to destroy our marriage. Rachel's defiance flickered, replaced momentarily by something else. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of her actions catching up to her. But she quickly masked it with a sneer. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. If you're so perfect, then go. See how far you get without me. David didn't hesitate. Farther than you think, he replied coldly. He grabbed the folder, his chair scraping softly as he stepped away from the table. Your free ride is over, Rachel. You wanted this life. Now you can live it. Alone. Without another glance, David walked out of the room, his footsteps deliberate and steady. Behind him, Rachel sat frozen, the anger in her eyes slowly giving way to the quiet realization that she had finally lost control. For David, each step away from the table felt lighter, as if he was shedding the weight of years of betrayal and lies. As he closed the door behind him, a sense of calm washed over him. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't a victim. He was free. The stranger laid down his snowboard pack and came over, looking down. He got a good look at Daniel. The courtroom buzzed with a subdued tension, the kind that seemed to hum beneath the surface as everyone took their seats. The judge's bench, elevated and imposing, loomed over the room, a stark reminder of the gravity of the proceedings. Rows of onlookers filled the gallery, their whispered speculations fading as the bailiff called the court to order. The faint clatter of pens against paper, the occasional shuffle of feet, all of it blended into a symphony of quiet anticipation. David sat at the respondent's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His expression was calm, but his jaw remained set, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Across from him, Rachel sat with her lawyer, her posture stiff but her face carefully composed. She wore a polished black dress, her makeup flawless, a mask meant to convey poise and victimhood. Yet David could see the subtle cracks in her facade, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table, the darting glance she cast toward the evidence binder on Carter's desk. Her lawyer, a man with a smooth, practiced voice, stood to begin. Your Honor, he started, stepping confidently into the center of the room. This is a case not of infidelity, but of neglect, emotional, marital, and personal. My client, Mrs. Rachel Parker, found herself in a marriage devoid of affection, trapped in a life where her needs were dismissed and her contributions undervalued. As he spoke, Rachel nodded along, her face adopting a pained expression. Occasionally, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a calculated gesture that drew a few sympathetic glances from the gallery. It is no wonder, the lawyer continued, that she sought solace and understanding elsewhere. Desperation, Your Honor. That is the root of her actions. Not malice. The words hung in the air for a moment, but they did little to sway David. He knew the truth, and soon, so would everyone else. Carter rose smoothly from his seat, his commanding presence immediately drawing the attention of the room. Your Honor, if I may, he began, his voice calm but firm. This is not a case of neglect. It is a case of betrayal, calculated, deliberate, and cruel. Carter gestured to the evidence binder, which the court clerk had already handed to the judge. Exhibit A, he said, his tone sharp. Financial documents. They show thousands of dollars siphoned from joint accounts into private ones, payments disguised as tuition fees, but used for luxury retreats and personal indulgences. Rachel's expression faltered as the judge scanned the documents. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Carter pressed on. Exhibit B, he said, turning toward the projector screen behind him. A series of photos appeared, each one more damning than the last. Rachel stepping out of a car with Eric, entering the penthouse, laughing with a glass of champagne in hand. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the sharp intake of breath from a spectator. Rachel's mask of composure cracked visibly now. She shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair tightly. Her lawyer rose to object, but Carter silenced him with a sharp, "I'm not finished, Your Honor." Exhibit C, Carter announced, his voice carrying a deliberate weight. He held up a small recorder before pressing play. Rachel's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. David's paying for all of this. The best part? He's so clueless it's almost cute. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a mix of shock and barely concealed disbelief. Rachel's head snapped toward her lawyer, her expression panicked. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The judge's gaze darkened as she looked toward Rachel, then back to Carter. "Do you have anything further?" the judge asked. Carter nodded, his tone unwavering. "Only the conclusion, Your Honor. The evidence before you demonstrates not just infidelity, but a betrayal of trust so profound that it undermines the very foundation of marriage. We request a ruling that denies any spousal support and ensures my client retains what is rightfully his." The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. "Mrs. Parker," she said, addressing Rachel directly, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Rachel's lips trembled as she tried to respond. This isn't the full story," she stammered, her voice shaky. He neglected me. He didn't care." "Enough," the judge interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "The evidence speaks for itself. This court concludes that Mrs. Rachel Parker has violated the trust and principles of marriage. The request for divorce is granted. Spousal support is denied. The respondent will retain all marital assets." The gavel struck, its sharp crack reverberating through the room. Rachel slumped in her chair, her face pale, her carefully constructed image shattered. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she stared blankly at the table, unable to process the finality of the moment. David rose from his seat, the weight that had pressed on him for months finally lifting. As he stepped out of the courtroom, the sunlight hit his face, warm and bright, a stark contrast to the cold, heavy atmosphere he had left behind. For the first time, he felt free. A new chapter awaited, and he was ready to embrace it. Rachel's once pristine world crumbled like a house of cards, leaving her with nothing but fragments of a life she could no longer afford. The sleek penthouse she had cherished, with its glass walls overlooking the city skyline, was the first to go. Forced to sell it to pay her mounting debts, Rachel stood in the empty living room one final time, her heels clicking against the bare floor. The luxury furniture, the paintings, and even the imported rugs, all had been liquidated, leaving behind cold, echoing silence. The vastness of the room seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. She moved into a small, sparsely furnished apartment on the outskirts of town. The elevator was slow and creaky, a far cry from the private access she once enjoyed. Gone were the fine linens and expensive scents that used to define her space. The new apartment smelled faintly of mildew, and her mismatched furniture seemed to close in around her. As she unpacked her last box, a few designer dresses she couldn't bear to part with, her hands trembled, the emptiness of her surroundings seeping into her chest. The financial ruin brought social exile with it. Friends who once flocked to Rachel's side, charmed by her wit and magnetism, vanished almost overnight. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Texts went unanswered, invitations stopped coming, and even her closest confidants seemed to find excuses to avoid her. She sat alone one evening, staring at her phone, scrolling through old group chats filled with laughing emojis and shared plans. Now, there was nothing but silence. The realization hit her hard. They weren't avoiding her because of her financial troubles. They were ashamed of her scandal. The sting of rejection deepened when Eric, the man she had risked everything for, disappeared entirely. His number was disconnected, his social media wiped clean of any trace of their connection. Rachel called endlessly, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly desperate, but the only response was silence. He had moved on, leaving her to face the fallout alone. Her days became a repetitive blur. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee, the single chair across from her a stark reminder of her isolation. Once the center of lavish parties and sparkling conversations, Rachel now spent her evenings in a suffocating quiet. Her only company, the faint hum of the refrigerator. The emotional toll was unrelenting. Rachel's once radiant appearance had faded. The glow that had drawn people to her was gone. Her hair, once meticulously styled, now hung limply around her face. fine lines etched deeper into her skin, and her once bright eyes now held a dull, vacant stare. She avoided mirrors, unable to confront the stranger staring back at her. She wandered through her days in a fog, carrying the weight of her choices. Every small indulgence, a bottle of wine, a rare trip to the salon, felt hollow, unable to fill the void left by her ruined reputation. The Rachel who had thrived on charm and power was gone, replaced by a shadow of her former self, bitter and adrift. As she sat by the window one rainy evening, watching droplets streak down the glass, she couldn't shake the gnawing ache of regret. Her world was gone, her wealth, her status, her friends, and there was no one left to blame but herself. The silence around her was deafening, a constant reminder of the consequences of her betrayal. Rachel Parker, once unstoppable, was now utterly alone. David sat at a quiet cafe one afternoon, sipping his coffee as he glanced out the window. Across the street, Rachel emerged from a rundown building, a bag slung over her shoulder, her posture slouched in a way he'd never seen before. She looked smaller somehow, her once commanding presence reduced to something muted and ordinary. David watched her for a moment, his expression calm, devoid of the anger or sorrow that had once consumed him. He felt no pity, no lingering ache in his chest. What he felt was closure. Rachel's downfall wasn't something he had orchestrated. It was the inevitable result of her choices. He realized as he sat there that he no longer carried the weight of her betrayal. The pain had receded, replaced by a quiet certainty that he had done everything he could, and it was enough. For months her name had haunted him, her actions replaying in his mind like a broken record. But now, as he watched her disappear into the building's dim interior, she was just a distant figure from a life he no longer lived. He took another sip of his coffee, feeling lighter than he had in years. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been more stark. While Rachel faded into obscurity, David thrived. He had poured his energy into rebuilding, not just his finances, but his sense of self. He'd renovated the house, transforming it from a space of painful memories into a sanctuary that reflected his new beginning. He reconnected with friends, explored hobbies he had long set aside, and even started traveling again, rediscovering the joy of living for himself. There were still moments when the past crept in, a fleeting thought, a memory, but they no longer held power over him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come. Rachel's betrayal had been a crucible, one that had burned away illusions and left him stronger, clearer in his values and his sense of worth. As David walked home that evening, the streets bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, he felt a deep sense of peace. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the sky stretched endlessly above him, a canvas of colors shifting from gold to deep purple. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open. Rachel had been a chapter in his life, one filled with lessons he hadn't asked for but ultimately needed. She had shown him the depths of betrayal, but also the resilience of his own spirit. David paused at his front gate, looking up at the home that was now entirely his. The weight of the past no longer hung over him. He had faced the storm, endured its fury, and emerged on the other side. He stepped through the door and into the warmth of his home, leaving the heavy shadows of his past behind. As the door clicked shut, David smiled faintly, his heart steady and light. He was free now. Free to build a future untainted by lies, a life rooted in honesty, strength, and peace. David stood in the center of his living room, the sunlight streaming through the large windows, illuminating the blank canvas he had decided to create. The house, once filled with painful memories and shadows of the past, was about to transform. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a paintbrush, and began to work. The walls, previously a dull beige that reminded him too much of Rachel's preference for neutrality, were now coated in a soft, calming sage green. Each stroke of the brush felt like wiping away another layer of his old life. He replaced the heavy curtains with sheer, light fabrics that let in more natural light. He rearranged the furniture, bringing in pieces that reflected his style. Bold, clean lines with warm, inviting colors. A large, lush monstera plant found a home in the corner of the room, its broad leaves breathing life into the space. The scent of fresh wood filled the air as he assembled new shelves to display books, travel mementos, and small pieces of art he'd collected over the years but never had the chance to showcase. The house was no longer a place of regret. It became a sanctuary, a space that embodied his renewed spirit. He even transformed the backyard, planting flowers and herbs, turning it into a peaceful retreat where he could sit with a cup of coffee in the mornings and plan his day. Financially, David became meticulous. He created a detailed budget, tracking every expense and prioritizing savings. The money Rachel had drained was a painful loss, but it also became a catalyst for him to regain control. He revisited old professional goals, enrolling in an online course to update his skills and open doors to new career opportunities. It wasn't just about rebuilding his bank account, it was about rediscovering his ambition and reclaiming the drive he had once put aside for someone else. With each small financial milestone, paying off a bill, reaching a savings goal, David felt a growing sense of pride. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. The discipline he cultivated in managing his finances mirrored the discipline he now applied to every part of his life. But it wasn't all work. David rekindled hobbies he had abandoned years ago. His old guitar, once gathering dust in a closet, now sat prominently in the living room. He began playing again, his fingers finding chords that felt both familiar and new. On weekends, he joined a hiking group, exploring trails and breathing in the crisp, rejuvenating air of the outdoors. His friends noticed the change, and so did he. Laughter came more easily now, and the weight he'd carried for years had lifted. He reconnected with old friends over dinners, reviving conversations that had once been drowned out by the chaos of his marriage. At the same time, he allowed himself to try new things, an art class, a cooking workshop, and even a spontaneous weekend trip to a nearby city. Each new experience felt like reclaiming another piece of himself. As the days turned into weeks, David found himself smiling more, laughing without hesitation, and waking up each morning with a sense of purpose. The house, his finances, his friendships, they were all reflections of the new life he was building. But more than anything, David realized he had rediscovered something invaluable: his own worth. One evening, as he sat on his newly renovated porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face, he gazed at the stars above. For the first time in years, the future felt wide open, unburdened by the weight of betrayal or regret. David had found himself again, and with that, he had found freedom. David's journey toward peace began with the small, deliberate choice to prioritize himself. Mornings that once started in chaos or silence now began with calm rituals. 10 minutes of quiet meditation, the scent of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, and soft sunlight streaming through his newly uncovered windows. The practice of mindfulness became his anchor, helping him to focus not on the wounds of the past, but on the possibilities of the present. He took up yoga, joining a class at a nearby studio where the rhythmic flow of movement and breath became a form of healing. At first, his body protested, stiff and resistant, but over time he found strength in the poses and clarity in the moments of stillness. He even began journaling, a quiet space where his thoughts found refuge. The pages filled with reflections on his pain, his lessons, and his emerging sense of self-worth. Through these practices, David found the ability to look at Rachel's betrayal not as a mark of his failure, but as a lesson in his resilience. "What I tolerated," he wrote in one journal entry, "is not a reflection of my value, but a reminder of the boundaries I need to set to protect myself." He read books on personal growth, diving into works about integrity, self-respect, and rebuilding after hardship. Each chapter became a stepping stone, guiding him toward a deeper understanding of his worth. David realized that his self-esteem was not tied to someone else's approval, but rooted in his own values and actions. Slowly but surely, the sting of betrayal transformed into a quiet resolve to live authentically, with honesty and self-respect as his guiding principles. Seeking further clarity, David planned a solo trip to the mountains. For years, traveling had been about compromise, about following Rachel's preferences and sacrificing his own. Now, for the first time, the journey was entirely his. He packed light, leaving behind the trappings of his old life, and set out for a week of solitude in nature. The crisp mountain air and the vast expanse of wilderness were humbling. Each step on the hiking trails, each sunrise viewed from a cliff's edge, reaffirmed his independence. He felt small, yet significant, a part of something much larger than his personal struggles. By the end of the trip, he returned home not just refreshed, but transformed, more certain of the man he was becoming. David's reflections on his journey were profound. In the quiet of his evenings, he often sat on his porch, pen in hand, writing down the milestones he had achieved. The house, once a prison of memories, was now his sanctuary. His finances, once shattered, were now on firm footing. His relationships, both with friends and himself, were stronger than ever. While working as a carpenter, looking back, he realized that the pain of betrayal had been the spark that lit the fire of his transformation. "I survived," he wrote in his journal one evening. "Not just that, I thrived, and I did it on my own terms." As he set goals for his future, learning a new language, traveling to places he had always dreamed of, starting a side business, David felt a quiet sense of pride. These ambitions were no longer about proving his worth to anyone else. They were about fulfilling his own dreams. One night, under a sky full of stars, he closed his journal and gazed out into the darkness, feeling both the weight of his past and the freedom of his present. The betrayal that once defined him was now just a chapter in his story, a chapter he had closed with strength and dignity. David took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. The future stretched before him, bright and boundless, and for the first time in years, he was ready to embrace it fully. The porch was bathed in the soft golden light of sunset, the kind that stretched shadows long and painted everything with a warmth that seemed to embrace the world. David stood at the railing, his hands resting lightly on the smooth wood, the faint scent of fresh grass wafting up from the garden below. The air was still, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze and the distant chirping of birds settling in for the night. He breathed deeply, letting the coolness of the air fill his lungs and steady his mind. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest was gone. His shoulders felt lighter, his stance taller, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped low, splashing the sky with streaks of amber and violet. It was a picture of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined his life not long ago. The house behind him, now vibrant and filled with warmth, reflected the man he had become. The muted greens and soft yellows of the walls, the books neatly lining shelves, and the thriving plants in every corner were all symbols of his new life. A life built not on compromise or deceit, but on truth and purpose. Every detail spoke of transformation, of resilience. David's thoughts drifted to the past, but this time, the memories didn't sting. Rachel's betrayal, once a wound that seemed insurmountable, now felt like a faded scar, visible but no longer painful. He could see it for what it was, a lesson, a catalyst for growth. It had stripped him bare, forced him to confront the parts of himself he had neglected, and given him the strength to rebuild. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. He had survived. More than that, he had reclaimed his life, his independence, his dignity, his joy. These were victories no one could take from him. The breeze picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers from the garden he had cultivated. It was a reminder of his journey, each petal a testament to the care and attention he had learned to give, not just to the plants, but to himself. The simple act of tending to the earth had become a metaphor for his own healing. David straightened, his posture strong, his hands leaving the railing as he stood tall. His eyes lifted to the horizon, where the last light of the sun lingered, promising a new dawn. He thought about the goals he had set, the trips he would take, the skills he wanted to master, the life he would live. Each step forward would be his, untainted by the shadows of the past. As the light faded into twilight, David turned to go back inside, the warmth of his home welcoming him. At the door, he paused for a moment, looking out at the darkening sky one last time. The betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been necessary. It had forced him to see his worth, to fight for his happiness, and to embrace the man he was meant to be. With a final deep breath, he stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The echoes of the past stayed outside, left in the cool night air. Inside, David's world was his own, a place of peace, hope, and boundless possibilities.